background, the methods, results, some of what occurred in the discussion, and a brief Q&A after. So really quick, I'm Naja. I'm one of the second year postdoctoral fellows here at the New Jersey Gun Violence Research Center. And soon I'll be transitioning out of my role to be the research director and program manager of the Wraparound Project, which is one of the first HFIPs in the country that was founded by Rochelle Thicker out in San Francisco. So a little bit of the background here. All right, so what we first see is language sensitivity is an important aspect of effective scholarship and service provision. So just in general, labels can reinforce stigmatizing stereotypes around various impacted groups or populations and can provoke various psychological reactions among different types of populations. And depending on what's going on at the time, affected groups use or prefer different labels than the ones that we as a society and even sometimes services ascribe to them by others. And this potentially leads to additional dissonance. And it's essential that healthcare and service providers, law enforcement, policymakers, and social scientists engage in language sensitivity for impacted groups in general that have psychological and social vulnerabilities, such as those that have experienced firearm violence. What we also see here in this second label is that Black men with firearm-related injuries have intersecting self-identities compounded with centuries of external labels that require language sensitivity. So if we think about men in general, this masculine socialization that requires men to project this image of strength, control, and agency. And if we separate out Black men, we think about how Black men have systematically been exposed to a range of labels forced upon them through problematic and racialized and institutional structures that have presented them as torpid and unintelligent. And also what is known is that the experience of firearm injury is not only just deeply personal, but it's also driven by decades of intentional disinvestment in certain neighborhoods and among different populations, and amongst other structural and institutional and policy factors. And again, can therefore be stigmatizing and harmful to the self-concept of Black men. However, what we found is that research has yet to deeply explore language or words that we associate with particular populations associated with Black men who've experienced the firearm injury. And that includes both external labels and also how they self-identify. And moving down, if we look at the dichotomy in terms of the differences between how we define victim and survivor. So victim is a label conventionally applied to a person who experienced interpersonal violence in this aspect that we're talking about. But the victim labeling also acknowledges wrongful, illegal, and harmful acts committed by one person against another. And additionally, the label of victim produces like an action towards social and legal recourse. And if we think about the concept of survivor, it's often been associated with personal characteristics such as resiliency, agency, active resistance, and recovery. But what we have also found is that there is this victim-survivor paradox that Thompson talks about, where it reflects the tension between the need to consider recourse stemming from a violent event and also the need to cope and overcome the events from the event. Next slide. So when someone is identifying themselves as a survivor, we tend to associate that with positive mental health outcomes. Whereas if someone identifies as a victim, we tend to associate that with negative mental health outcomes such as shame, PTSD, and also depression. But what possibly distinguishes survivors from victims is that survivors externalize or tend to externalize their feelings, which tend to facilitate actions, whereas victims tend to internalize their feelings, which we think contributes to feelings around shame and also immobility to overcome what has happened. And when we think about the concept of self-appraisal, we have to think about existing labels or general terms that are applied to both victims and survivors, and how both victims and survivors can make sense of their own experiences and how they differ from the socially constructed meanings that we as society have given them. And also, some choose not to utilize the dichotomous appraisal of survivor and victim when it comes to their experiences, or they tend to reject those labels themselves and apply their own individualized labels, which is what we see here in this particular, which we'll see here in this particular study. And I want to note that self-appraisal is not a static process, and that a victim can transition into identifying as a survivor, and also a survivor can identify as being a victim. But this is done when there's a commitment to reflection and healing. And again, some may acknowledge the harm that they've experienced and seek recourse. And also to note that language portraying this victim survivor labels as this spectrum, it's very, very recent. And we tend to rely on the person who's experienced the potentially life-threatening or altering event to appraise themselves in ways in which, that is most authentic to them. But what's most important is that we need to understand self-appraisal amongst those that are injured by firearm violence. So here we discuss the first quote is pulled from Annie Betts's work, where she discusses using avoiding using the language like innocent victims, as she puts in quotes, because those words imply that some people deserve to get shot. So basically, we're trying to be cognizant of the words that we're using. And what is known is that Black men experience firearm injury and death at an alarming and disproportionate rate. So what we want to do is, because the continued injury warrants further research, we need to put into our minds and center the population that is affected most. And we can do this by way of supporting Black men's self-identification of their own experiences, to highlight the structural inequities that contribute to the context and environment in which firearm violence occurs. And this research fills a gap that we just have not seen before. So to move further ahead, so some methods. So this was a small pilot, a qualitative descriptive approach project. The sample size here was fairly small, but you had to identify as a Black African-American male, over 18, survived a firearm injury. And what's most important here is you had to have been an active or past participant of the hospital-based violence intervention program in which the study was conducted at. So these interviews were conducted in the summer of 2020. We had a semi-structured interview guide. Everything was done over the phone because we wanted to be cognizant that everybody didn't have internet access. So we stayed away from Zoom and WebEx platforms. But the main question that we asked here was, did you identify as a victim? Did you identify as a victim or survivor? And what made you choose those terms or reject those terms? So again, we had an N of 10, but what we realized going through the transcripts, the research team and I, is out of the 10, only 9 produced responses that helped us try to understand this particular question. And as you can see here, that majority of the participants were unemployed and on Medicaid. The ages were between 21 and 44. And again, everybody was actively or had past participants of the HFIT. So what do we find here? So for the first theme, it's labeled, I never considered myself a victim, I'm a survivor. So several individuals self-subscribed to this label of victim. They chose that term on their own, and their descriptions of self were as strong-minded. It alluded to survival as this act of higher power, and their narratives of perseverance are consistent with both resilience and post-traumatic growth. And although I like to note here that when we think about resilience, we think about this concept of like this active positivity. So it's not that it's necessarily resilience, but within this space, this is how we'll define it. And if you look at the last quote that says, I'm a survivor, I survived them shots, this particular participant subscribed to the traditional definitions of a survivor and victim, if you look at what he says, because he's associating survivor with agency and also victim with passivity. And for some, being a survivor is about physically, emotionally, and mentally surviving not only their injuries, but any adverse circumstances or events that they had no choice but to confront because they're still alive. And their narratives encourage us to consider survivorship in the context of life adversities and not just the siloed firearm event. The second quote, I feel like a victim, I'm still alive. Here, these particular individuals, they self-label themselves as both. They identified as both, but under different circumstances. So the first participant saw himself as both a physical victim, but a victim of mainstream institutions, as he mentions law enforcement in his quotes. And he mentions the police directly because he felt like he was a victim of structural violence because no one investigated his shooting or his incident. And due to the inability of the police doing that, he felt harmed by these structures that were put in place to ensure public safety. And lastly, here's a participant that actively rejected the labels of survivor and victim. And out of the 10, 2 participants rejected these labels. He labeled himself as a warrior, right? He was physically and mentally engaged in the struggle of recovering after his firearm incident. And for him, the warrior symbolized belonging to an honor-bound belief system, right? He saw what occurred to him also as a way of life. And what we know is that warriors in intergroup conflicts achieve non-material rewards in the form of praise, of reputation enhancement, social status, and also admiration. And also the last person that rejected the quote of both the labels of survivor and victim, he saw himself as a casualty, which I thought was very interesting because we understand a casualty as a person that is injured or killed, and it has this military connotation to it. But he believes and accepts that whatever happens to him comes with the territory of living in the hood. And again, another person that sees it as just this way of life. So when we think about the words warrior or a casualty, we traditionally used to describe participants again in war, which relates to how violence in concentrated places are often perceived as battle zones and or war zones amongst individuals and or groups. And again, there's also these mirroring effects of hypervigilance, trauma, and mental and physical injuries also associated with military personnel when we think about the words warrior and casualty. And also, just to give you just to wrap up the results really quick, the 2 participants with these alternate labels suggested that there's more variations when it comes to self-identifying yourself following a firearm injury, and these need to be explored. And just to go through the discussion briefly, here we found some notable findings, and one of them being that none of the participants identified exclusively as a victim, which I thought was very interesting. And again, we could attribute this to Black men subscribing to hegemonic masculinity, where they see themselves as being strong. They're not allowed to be vulnerable. They have to associate themselves with being on a certain pedestal that society has ascribed to men in general. And again, these findings also reveal that self-labeling goes beyond the binary of just victim and survivor. Also, there's this nuanced understanding that we need to acknowledge that both interpersonal and structural natures of stressors that are faced by Black men that could inform protective factors and methods of self-appraisal, that they possibly can see themselves again beyond the spectrum of victim and survivor, and that racialized stereotypes of Black men, such as being hypermasculine or superhumanly resilient may also influence injured Black men leaning towards utilizing the word survivor or rejecting it and opting for a different word that is associated with being strong, such as warrior, such as mainly warrior, not necessarily a casualty. And when we think about this context, the community context of chronic violence and poverty exposure in disinvested urban neighborhoods, along with the distrust of historically oppressed systems and institutions like the criminal legal system, this also could potentially shape the labeling of how we look at people that, Black men in particular, that survive their injuries. And when internalizing this victim identity, this also could exacerbate trauma reactions, negative cognition about self-worth, and feeling of powerlessness, things that are opposite of what hegemonic masculinity is telling men in general that they should be. So they should be powerful, they should have self-worth, they should be the breadwinners. And also feeling of helplessness, as men they are required to be independent. But when you're injured and you're labeling yourself as a victim, you tend to internalize these feelings of helplessness, and then which can lead to other mental health systems such as depression and PTSD. And when you adopt this survivor identity, again, it could possibly facilitate resilience and also post-traumatic growth by enhancing one's self-efficacy, maybe leading to hope, motivation to heal, and maybe perceived control. But we found that some scholars tend to focus exclusively on one term, mainly around survivorship. And what we found is that we don't see this research in spaces like this because we tend to associate the concept of survivorship or surviving with cancer or domestic violence or IPV work. So broader, just from a public policy scale, we just need more reform, right, to address the systematic marginalization across healthcare, criminal justice, education, and other institutions that fail not only Black communities, but Black men, and in particular, but violently injured Black men. And we're calling for a multifaceted approach across these areas so that we can shift the social environment to reduce the stigma and promote health-seeking behavior among violently injured Black men. So this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to visit all of the avenues to see what's going on. How can we make these services culturally congruent? Because it can be attributed that maybe some Black men, violently injured Black men, are not seeking out services such as VOCA, Victims of Crime Act money, because they don't see themselves as victims. So maybe there needs to be a change in language. Just a few limitations. Again, the sample was small because it was done during COVID. Active or past participants, we probably should be recruiting more people that were just recently injured and see how they identify themselves, and wait a time period to see maybe after a year or so how they self-appraise themselves. Transferability, again, COVID-19. And we weren't allowed to do our own recruitment. We had to depend on the case managers with their active and past caseloads to do the recruitment. And in-person recruitment, again, was not allowed. And just some final thoughts. Again, a lot of the services need to be culturally congruent and need to be more tailored to the population in which it's serving. So if we're talking about Black men, we need to keep in mind the intersectionality of being potentially disabled, injured, being Black, and also being a male. So I want to thank the young Black men who participated in the interviews for their honesty and insight and contributions to understanding this topic. References.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baker. We appreciate your presentation. It was very informative. If anybody has any questions,